to something we were talking about yesterday, actually, and this is around Sara Sharif and the fact that the judge in the case has said that the previous judges, the family court judges, can't be named. He's put a gagging order on that, and there was, I think, perhaps a little bit of confusion that people thought, and I thought as well, actually, that perhaps the social workers couldn't be named in all of this. We've got a bit of clarity on that. Apologies for the confusion on that. But Marcella Leonard is with us. She's a social worker and director of the Leonard Consultancy. And Marcella, it's great to talk to you this morning. Thank you for joining us. And on this Sara Sharif case, I think there's just a lot of frustration from an awful lot of people that perhaps accountability won't happen. They hear a lot of reviews, they hear a lot of thoughts and ideas that, you know, lessons will be learned from these cases. Yet in this case, 15 times, in fact, there were chances to save Sara Sharif, this little girl, and then it didn't happen. What is your thought on how we should deal with this?
Good morning, Peter. Thank you for having me on. I think firstly, it's just one of those cases of extreme sadness when you realise the litany of heroin abuse that wee girl suffered at the hands of somebody who actually fundamentally should have been the person to protect her in life. And I think it's the level of the violence is just so shocking that her little body, I mean, you're showing a picture of her now, I mean, her little body had just to sustain and live her final days and months and weeks in this life under such pain. It's just horrendous. And it's horrendous because very, very sadly, Sarah's not the first child to die in such circumstances. And I think fundamentally we need to really look at what has happened and to properly learn from it to make sure this doesn't happen again. But there are failings and there are fundamental failings as to how come a 10-year-old child can die in such extreme violence in the UK in today's world, and that happened. There fundamentally is questions that have to be asked about her death, like many other children's death.
As you know, Baby P, there have been cases where you are in Northern Ireland. We know about Victoria Clambier and so on. This seems to just keep happening. What are the challenges for social workers? Because I know there are a load of social workers, I'm sure including yourself, Marcella, who do a very, very good job, who really do work hard and do have the best interests of the children at heart. But there are clearly people who have failed here. There are clear failings in all those cases that I have just mentioned there, and this keeps happening. We keep hearing about these cases, and there are extreme things as well. There are things that should be noticed and should be acted upon that aren't. Is this a systematic failing? Is this human error? What do you think it is?
Well, I think there's a couple of things, Peter. I think firstly, you've always got to remember that as child protection social workers, we're dealing with people who fundamentally, unfortunately, are human and are causing harm to children. So you've got to work that you're already working sometimes against the flow. You're already trying to work with people who fundamentally, for example, in this case here, you're dealing with a man who had a fundamental belief in the use of violence in his home. He fundamentally believed in what he called legitimate punishment. He fundamentally believed that the only thing that went wrong was that his beatings went too far. So when you're dealing with somebody of such extreme beliefs, it's very, very difficult to decide, well, what are we going to do in that? I think there were here, we've got to remember, firstly, that child grew up in a home where it wasn't only just the fact her father was violent to her. Her stepmother completely complicit and agreed with that violence. An uncle was present in that house. The fact that she was homeschooled, there was no other safe adult in that child's life. The neighbours heard and felt they could do nothing, but also the stepmother's family knew and felt and didn't do anything. So you've either got a culture, and this is very difficult for social workers to break into, if you have a family where there's a culture of belief in that violence is okay, that aggression is okay, that domestic abuse is okay, that misogyny is okay, that it's all right to use your children in some ways, your own property, to do what you like. It's very difficult for a social worker to break into that. However, equally, there were signs here that the social workers could have stepped in. That, you know, there was, when the child was at school, there was bruises, but within a month that case was closed. No case of physical abuse, Peter, should be closed within 1 month because, for example, things like, and I don't know because I don't know, obviously there's a whole load of confidential material that we, you know, unless you carry out the review, you'll not get to know. Yes. But if, for example, a proper medical was carried out in that child at the time of those bruisings, would you have been able to identify other, for example, bruising that would have been there? That would have given more indication of this not being a one-off incident of, a parent potentially just on the spur of the moment, maybe losing it and becoming upset and being very sad and sorry for what they've done. But also, for me, the closing of the case, it wasn't just the closing of the case within the month. The very fact that he then removed the child from the school is more than just a red flag. That would be very clearly, you would have been saying there, hold on a moment, this family has just had a child. We've just been questioning this child about bruising, and they've now removed that child from school. That immediately should have been...
And I think a lot of people...
Get a stronger colour than red. It should have been a strong red colour, a flag.
Of course, and I think a lot of people, Marcella, will say, you've pointed that out. That is a very clear point. Yet this was missed. And there are so many people who worry about this. And they worry about, I think, the accountability aspect. And I wonder if I could just ask you about this idea from the judge that previous family court judges and people involved with this case can't be identified. Do you think that's the right opinion, this gagging order that has been put out there? Because a lot of people will feel, where is the accountability here?
I think, Peter, I suppose I'm one of these people. It's not about necessarily naming and shaming. I think for me, genuinely, I'm one of these individuals where I think I would be of this strong belief and I'm understanding that there will be a very clear review carried out in this case. And within that review, everybody that would have been involved will be named within that review to get the learning. If I can maybe move it, rather than it's just about the gagging of individuals, where I think the concern is, sadly, this wee child is not the first child to die in such violence in the UK. What the issue is why are we not learning from the previous cases rather than only focusing on the gagging? My issue is, why have we not learned from previous cases? There's where the accountability is. And is that because there is no learning from, for example, in the family court judges? Is there no learning in terms of the social workers? Is there no learning in terms of, for example, from the police, from the neighbourhood? Why did the neighbourhood not feel they could say anything? Is there no proper resources going in terms of to help? So was the case closed, for example, because of caseloads? And I would have to say currently...
Okay, but I think with within what you say there, Avril, there will be people who say, look, we've had reviews like this before. We've had all sorts of times when this has clearly been unacceptable. I mean, you have said it's hard to know what to do when a family abuser believes fundamentally and culturally that violence is not acceptable in the home. But many would argue actually that's not difficult. It's illegal. There's a law there. There's a framework in which a social worker can act and be very, very clear there. Surely that's correct.
Peter, that's absolutely correct. And I suppose what I meant by that was that it's whenever a social worker enters into a family like that, that family just closes ranks. And what tends to happen as well, the child learns to say nothing. The child learns that... But
surely it's up to the social workers to penetrate that family and to say, to be the voice and to be the advocate for the child within that.
Completely, Peter. And what they need to do as well is, in order to do that, they need to remove that child from that house. There's no point in questioning a child, for example, in a school, and then the child would return home that evening, because the child's only going to get punished more for telling. So I think we need much more proactive child protection. But in order to do that, we need to be able to say, for me, the big error here is, how come when a child, there was already bruising, the school did their job, the school noticed it and reported it to social services, but to say and to close a case within a month, when there's physical bruising of a 10-year-old child, is very significant.
Why do you think there were 15 different times when this could have been dealt with and weren't? I mean, you've mentioned a couple of them there, but there were 15 different occasions when this actually could have been prevented, when this child could have been taken into care, when these people perhaps could have been prosecuted. I mean, that is a huge systematic failure. That's not one or two things that went wrong. That's 15 different things that went wrong.
I think part of the problem, Peter, sometimes is that where everybody sees an incident and an incident is being treated as an individual incident as opposed to cumulative effect, and realising this is cumulative.
Will a review sort that? Will a review sort that out? Because I think, again, it comes back to the fundamental point to say, well, lessons can be learned. But are they actually ever learned? Have you seen in your career, actually, that lessons are learned, that systems are better? Because cases like these, I know they're extreme, I know that they're not that rare, but they do keep happening.
They do keep happening, and I suppose what's tending, I suppose, Peter, in my, certainly from domestic violence, so one of the core issues, for example, about this individual, this man, I mean, this man's previous in terms of Sarah's mother, was known domestic violence, and that was why that original relationship, my understanding is why that broke up. So you've also got to look at the links between, for example, domestic violence and child abuse. You've got to look at the links in terms of that understanding coming from a cultural perspective that punishment of a child is legitimate as long as you don't beat them so hard. You know, you've got to look at all of those things, and I think when
but
you're
we can't ever accept that. I know you're not suggesting we should accept that, but we can't accept that at any point. I wonder about resources and social workers, vacancies. There are quite a few vacancies, of course, the workload there. Presumably this is leaving children vulnerable as well when there just aren't enough people to actually intervene, and when they do intervene, they're pressed because they have so many cases.
Resources is significant. For example, here in Northern Ireland, a lot of our trusts are sitting with, for example, a 50%, up to sometimes a 50% vacancy in child protection. So you're absolutely right. Resources matter. But also what matters as well is that, again, it's not just the resources. What we're having is, for example, because the vacancies are in child protection, we tend to get quite newly qualified or less experienced social workers going into child protection because there's where the vacancies are. And I'm not saying necessarily they're getting, for example, are they getting all the supervision they need, all the resources that they need? The cases are piling up. There is no doubt, without any doubt, the number of cases being referred into social services now is greater than it ever was in terms of that complexity. And that's partly got to do with, for example, it's got to do with poverty, it's got to do with addictions, it's got to do with mental health, it's got to do with domestic violence, it's got to do with all sorts of different cultural, societal reasons as well.
You mentioned you could mention the cultural aspect of that, and actually we had someone mention that yesterday in the programme. Can some of this failure be down perhaps to cultural sensitivity? Oh, I don't understand this, I don't want to intervene necessarily. I'm thinking of the Rotherham aspect previously, the grooming gangs, and the fact that in this case you're saying, you know, obviously the family believed fundamentally different things to what are often seen, what are values in this country often of, you know, we don't beat our kids, we don't see violence as a weapon, there are very strong laws around smacking, for example.
I think we can't ignore culture, and we have to name it for what it is. I mean, whenever he was first said, he actually said it was that he didn't mean to kill her, he just beat her too hard. I mean, if you have that fundamental belief that violence, it is horrendous. I mean, so you can't not ignore and tiptoe around. There is a cultural aspect here because also the family system supported that as well. So I think we need to be very clear about that. But
when you know that, Marcella, when you know that, when that's clear, surely the second that a parent or guardian reveals they think beating a child is okay, that child should be urgently removed.
I think there has been clearly a missed opportunity here, Peter, to remove this child. But I think we also need to remember as well, not just Sara, because the other children in that house, what must it have been like for them to watch that violence, to see their sibling tied up on a bed, to see their sibling being beaten, to see their sibling crying, to see their sibling with a bag over their head. So I think we also need to remember there was other children in that house that were equally exposed to the same level of violence. Now, we may not have evidence that they were directly hit, but what we do know, whether that's domestic violence or child abuse, they've also witnessed that. So for me, it wasn't just about stepping in for Sara. They needed to look at all of the children in that home. And I think that's of significance as well, in terms of that we also had 5 other children who never said anything that we know of. So why is that? Were they that frightened to be able to speak? Or were they given a cultural belief as well that
or both?
Because or both, absolutely. So I think it's to me there are cultural questions, there's resource questions, there's a fundamental understanding of domestic violence and misogyny that needs to be addressed in the review of this case.
Marcella, thank you very much indeed. That's Marcella Leonard there. She's a social worker and director of the Leonard Consultancy. What do you think about this?